Welcome to Taking Stock. A former fellow student posed a question on Twitter recently. It was, who, in your opinion, is currently the most effective Christian influencer in the public eye? Several likely candidates were cited in the Twitter exchange that followed, most of which I've never heard of, but prominently amongst them were the Reverends Kate Botley and Richard Coles, of course. One of the thoughts that prompted in me was how literal some people are, and how quickly some people identify Christian with clerical collar, and how that inevitably slides from clerical collar to vicar, and to the Church of England in particular. And yet, if I'm honest, those who've most deeply impacted me on my development as a Christian have seldom, if ever, been in possession of a clerical collar. I'm thinking in particular of my mother's brother, my uncle, Sidney Cooper, Uncle Sid. Uncle Sid was born in 1918, grew up during the Great Depression in the 1930s in a little pit village in Yorkshire called South Kirkby. Needless to say, like his dad and his brother, my Uncle Ernie, he went down the pit when he left school. Like my Uncle Ernie as well, he served his country in World War II. Unlike my Uncle Ernie, who joined the army and stayed there for many years after the Second World War, Uncle Sid was in the RAF as ground crew, maintaining aircraft in the Battle of Britain, which, I have to say, was fabulous when I was 7 and building Airfix Spitfires, Hurricanes and Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Because even though I'm colourblind, building them with Uncle Sid meant I never got colours or the camouflage patterns wrong. He saw to that. Uncle Sid was a devout Methodist Christian. With his brother and another young man, he answered an altar call, as they call it, in his little Methodist chapel and offered for the Methodist ministry. My mum always used to say that the other young man was a bloke called Arnold Skelding, but it may not have been. So if any of Arnold's family are around and incredibly listening to this, my apologies if the biographical details on your predecessor are wrong. However, like his brother, Ernie, Uncle Sid was already married at the time, and Arnold, if indeed 'twas he, was single. So Arnold was accepted for training for the ministry, and my two uncles were turned down. At that time, married men weren't allowed to train for the Methodist ministry. My Uncle Sid became a local preacher, whilst still, of course, working down at pit, and my auntie was a Sunday school teacher. I think my grandmother was the chapel organist as well at the time, but I might be wrong about that. She was certainly almost the unofficial village midwife. But Methodist historians of the South Yorkshire Coalfield Mission will be able to confirm or deny any of those roles played by members of my family. Anyway, throughout his life, my uncle was a devout Methodist. Although he smoked like a chimney, he never touched a drop of the hard stuff, which, according to my mother, almost caused a diplomatic incident at the wedding reception when his daughter, my cousin, married out of Methodism and into the Church of England. And he ended his working life with 15 years as live-in steward at Luton Industrial College, the now sadly defunct brainchild of the hugely charismatic Reverend Bill Gowland. And then my uncle and aunt retired to Kirkby Malzard in North Yorkshire, near Ripon. I went to college to train for the Methodist ministry. By my time, the no married candidates for the ministry or theological students rule had gone, thankfully. My uncle sent me his copy of the Greek New Testament, which by then must have been 50 years old. He never told me when he picked up the copy, but he inscribed it thus: "Dear Alan, hope you can use this. I couldn't. Sid." In his retirement, he became a lay pastor in the circuit in which he lived, looking after the chapel he attended and preaching somewhere almost every week, right up until, literally, the day he died. He was actually preaching in the pulpit of his chapel when he suffered a stroke. He died later that day in hospital. But to the very end, he retained his very dry Yorkshire sense of humour. In the pulpit of that little chapel, there was a brass plaque to the memory of a minister who, years before, had dropped dead in the pulpit. For all I know, it might still be there if that chapel was open. When Auntie Gladys and the rest of the congregation rushed to his aid, apparently he said, whilst lying on the floor, "Good heavens, lass, I thought you were going to have to put another plaque in the pulpit for a minute." I'm not sure if those were his last words, I kind of hope they were, but almost certainly it was his last joke. Now, Uncle Sid was at best an autodidact. He was self-taught. He never went to college, never extended his formal education beyond the age of 14, never rose to any great heights by secular standards in his working life, and, thanks to a rule which was as nonsensical as it was wasteful, never had his call to ordained ministry endorsed by the church, to which he devoted so much of his time and his energy. Despite all those salient points in his biography, and despite his apparent insignificance, I know that in the ministry which he exercised throughout his life, endorsed by the church or otherwise, his influence over many people was immense. It was a matter of some ironic humour, really, that in that tiny chapel, which was in the middle of a farmyard as far as I could see, the man who was turned down for the ordained ministry had at least 9 ordained clergy of 2 denominations at his funeral, including myself, although I was there as his nephew obviously, and his son-in-law, because my cousin not only married out of Methodism into the Church of England, but her husband became a vicar. Now, I loved my uncle, clearly, but you know something? Although his influence on me was exceptional, in the wider world, his life and witness were in many ways unexceptional. And I don't mean that in any sense derogatorily. He lived his life, in fact they lived their lives, because I include my aunt in this, entirely according to their values and in the service of the Lord they had come to know as children or teenagers, and who never abandoned them or in their eyes ever led them astray. That he didn't let the disappointment of being turned down for candidacy for the ministry negatively impact the rest of his life is itself a testament to the strength not only of his faith, but ironically also of the calling to ministry, which remained unendorsed by Methodism until the last years of his life as a lay pastor. But how many Sid Coopers are there now, or have there been, in your life? Ordinary people in ordinary jobs, unregarded and uncelebrated in public life, but who've shown you a pattern of life in faith, even if they haven't necessarily realised that they are doing so, and which has engendered or nurtured your own faith, and which in turn has enabled you to deal with life as it is, so often raw, and so often jagged-edged, and so often challenging. And once you recognise the Uncle Sids in your own life, name them. And whether they are brother, sister, cousin, aunt, uncle, parent or friend, once you recognise their quiet influence on your life and on others around them, ask yourself this question. Whose Uncle Sid or Auntie Gladys am I? Or could I be? Because in every interaction in which you participate, you have the opportunity to become, if only for one person, such an influence as even you cannot imagine. Perhaps, who knows, 30 years after your death, someone, somewhere, will be pondering upon Christian influences. And it won't be Reverend Richard Coles or Reverend Kate Botley, with all due respect, that they'll be remembering. It'll be you. Stay safe, people.